Joan just spoke, Stina spoke earlier, but maybe Billy, you want to introduce yourself quickly, because, yeah.
Sure. My name is, check, is this on? My name is Billy Rinnekamp. I'm a founder of Folia, which is a space for NFTs. We collaborated with Joan on the
forgot to
through the
say,
pieces.
thanks to him, all these works were made.
Also the founder of Trifle, which is a new on-chain game company that's sort of arose out of the result of feeling like a category of strictly art was limiting when so much of the work we were producing and helping produce had elements of interactivity that just felt like maybe closer to the realm of sort of games or something, or the desire to sort of blur that line. So I work between art and games, you could say, and collaborate with a lot of artists on on-chain NFTs. I've been doing that since about 2017.
That's actually the first question I wanted to ask all of you, which is a lot of the things, especially what Sarah was talking about, some of the earlier conversations, the sort of notion of a game, already really hard to define anyway. What is a game? Famously, Wittgenstein struggled with that for a few pages, and clearly these things, the art things, are moving closer towards interactive, gamified things, and a lot of the games are moving towards sort of spatialized, kind of like wondrous places, which could be, in some ways, as art pieces. Does it even matter to have any stringent definition of these two, or do you think something is emerging that's like kind of a blur between the sort of what traditionally we had as very separate categories? So I guess the question is, does it matter that it's difficult to, the lines are blurred? And if it doesn't, then what is this new thing? And why is it so digital, fundamentally, as well? I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab, yeah.
It fits really well with the space. I mean, crypto and blockchain is kind of built upon a speculation scenario, which is a gaming scenario, more or less. So I think this aspect of some of the pieces blurring a little bit more into games kind of fits very well within the space.
This term composability is used a lot in the space, and it's sort of the permissionless building upon something that one person built for maybe a very specific purpose, but is able to be perhaps leveraged for other pieces. And I think that this characteristic makes sort of everything out there by default possibly a game. And I often come back to this really useful matrix that's from this play theorist named Bernard Suits. And it's a matrix of the player types. So you've got players who play with the rules and play with the objective. And of course you have cheaters who play with the objective, usually to win, but they change the rules. And then you have someone who plays with neither the rules nor the objective. That's a spoil sport, somebody who walks right through the middle of the field. But there's the fourth quadrant, and that's somebody who plays with the rules but without the objective. And that's actually called a trifler, and it's where the name of the company came from. And it's been sort of a guiding light in my practice for years. And I think that any sort of blockchain application that's been deployed is sort of primed for this kind of interactivity, in which the system itself can be used, the rules are there, it'll run exactly how it's designed to run, but you can use it for a completely different purpose. And I think that this sort of playfulness is a way to sort of very easily invert systems, and that is often the primary sort of structure in an artwork, but also in many sort of games, making a game out of something that wasn't meant to. And I think we saw it just here on Joan's work, where the piece is about infinitely generating as many wallets indefinitely forever and forever, but that same structure can be used to make their own game, which is, oh, I'm going to try to make a wallet that actually is just the same word repeated, and I can do that by sort of reverse engineering the system or doing something completely, unintended from the artist. And that, as well as the sort of escape game that was built into that, are sort of examples of a structure that people can exploit and play upon. And it's all about the sort of unintended consequences that erupt from these sort of public spaces that have structures that are immutable and will continue, uncensorable. You can't really prevent people from doing novel things with them. And I think that's just really well suited to games as well.
Yeah, I think games are just a puppet theater, and I like them. Yeah, they are standing for, as I say, it's a puppet theater. It's like, it pretends like, okay, you are in a game, and there are like these visuals around it. And basically a game is more like a system, and a system you play with. So you have some rules, and you play it, and you can cheat the rules, and you can do whatever. Yeah, and it has visuals. I mean, a shooting game has a gun, a ball game has a ball. So that are the visuals, but then you can also, in a computer it becomes more and more like, as I say, a puppet theater. It's not real. If you play soccer on the field, you have a physical ball. But if you play it online, the FIFA, you only play with the puppets. So there's this virtual fantasy around games, but in the background, it's kind of fascinating that I was just checking, because when I looked for a good hex converter, I basically came to this weird site, which I used to convert hex. But then, yeah, I don't know, it's a free academy how to learn about the blockchain. And then if you go to the tools, you have like several coins, and then there's a game theory. Why the fuck there's game theory in in a site like this, where you basically, the course overview is like, okay, how to make your own NFT, but there's a whole game theory and the blockchain, and it's playing tic-tac-toe. And tic-tac-toe, yeah, we made a game about tic-tac-toe because it was like the first AI game playable by AI. So the first AI was tested in a game. And if you want to test a computer, and you have like the blue IBM to play chess and Google to play Go. So games are also a way to test your technology. So there are different layers of games.
So is there, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I also don't necessarily know if it's something that's emerging now. I mean, I think like in the capacity of Jody, you've been doing games for a long time. But I mean, we're also, like a few years ago, everyone was doing immersive art, even though that wasn't necessarily something new, it just became hyped. And I have a little bit of the same feeling with this kind of hybrid between art and games. It's actually been around for a really, really long time. It's just gained traction, and therefore all of a sudden it's in the limelight. But we're also, as an industry, extremely good at claiming that we're the first ones to do it, even though we aren't necessarily. And I think that's very important to remember, that there is a big, big, big chance that this has been done before. It's just that we are sometimes a little bit too arrogant to do the research and then claim that we're the first one to do it.
I think something different is, though, when looking at it through the lens of performance. So performance always has this sort of like hosted environment in which the performance can take place. Maybe on one end of the spectrum, you could say like public art is sort of an ongoing performance all the time. But an immutable ledger, an online space, even more so than a website hosted by a single person, has this persistence of the public space and the interactivity that's possible through the performance that I think is relatively new. And this persistence, I think, is what we see, as sort of like compounding or accumulating the sort of particles of the interactions that are possible in there that I was sort of mentioning earlier, that there's always sort of an interface that somebody else can add to or put another layer on and look through to the underlying strata with.
Yeah, it seems to me like, I think Bill is right. It seems to me like when you deploy systems that are open access and stay on for a while, probably the things that people just naturally do with them, maybe as a law of nature, is like either try to make money or just play around and like fuck with them, right? And so
Why not both?
I was about to say, it seems like this kind of stuff is the overlap of these two things. I'm not sure if you can like formalize that and just say like that's what happens to systems, but maybe you can. I don't know.
That angle makes me think too of a distinction and maybe a reason why games start to edge in on this definition space of art or games is that nobody seems to have a problem with commerce being involved in games, where there is this sort of taboo relationship between commerce and art, that one sort of necessarily compromises the other, although we know from the history of art and value that's it's much more complicated than that.
My take on that is that it's the fact that the commerce side of the online art, on the crypto art side specifically, is just so overbearing to everything else that it's just like, if you remember when Blur started happening, right? You started to have the thumbnail of the NFT get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And the floor price sort of chart get bigger and bigger and bigger. With what you end up having is literally just an order book, right? And it doesn't matter what the underlying asset is. So, okay, commerce is nice, but index. And it seems like crypto projects have a propensity to that at a much higher rate than non-crypto projects. And that's at least where my concern sits. It's not like, it's not necessarily vilifying commerce for its own sake. I think it's great that it's actually in the open, but there is such a thing as being in the open to the extent that there's nothing else left for you to like engage with in a deeper, meaningful way, basically.
Which is maybe not as much of an issue for games, in the sense that like crypto itself is a giant PvP game. Trading is game, the game theory of that as well. Game theory, I'm glad you brought that up too, Joan. It made me think about sort of when designing blockchain protocols, people are really, they think about the game theory of the interactions a whole lot, because it's sort of very frequently you set it and you forget it. You can't change it once it's out there. And it's an extremely hostile environment to be persistently online and to have money as a primitive in your programming language. And so I feel like this is a recurring theme in sort of like trying to understand every possible angle that this thing will ever be seen or interacted with through. And it reminds me of one of like my biggest anxieties with art and performance art especially, and even more so interactive performance art, is that the artist's vision, the artist's intention is constantly subject to being trampled by the audience experiencing it incorrectly or over-rolling or overriding or disrupting, And I think artists have certainly played with that in ways that try to sort of encourage that or build an artwork which will never be, overrun by the interactive elements, but I think that's a very difficult task. And when deploying an artwork on a blockchain, it sort of is by default interactive. Even just the ownership is, always going to be present as a level of interactivity. And it's extremely scary, I think, when you think about it through that lens as an artist, but also is what sort of allows for these happy accidents, unexpected results, and again, sort of composability too.
This actually ties in quite well with public art as well in terms of curating context and kind of putting certain pieces who are meant to interact with the public in kind of a community way. And there's a really great book written about it called Curating Context, which is about this idea like how do you curate pieces that you actually can't curate beyond a certain point? Where does this curating stop, and where do you like leave it to grow on its own? And do you have to control it? And how do you make sure that it stays within a safe environment as well within certain communities? Because there's an interview with an artist who is building these community spaces in minority, predominantly immigrant areas in Gothenburg. And it was kind of put into the scenario of the community saying, you can do whatever you want. But the money came from the municipality, so of course there was restrictions in terms of what they could do and what they couldn't do. At the same time, as the artist said, I cannot guide it. So it's kind of this idea of where do you just let it go? Where do you let it run free? And how do you accept that it might not take the route that you don't want to take it?
I mean, I think that's a big, what is the word, not juxtaposition, but incongruence with blockchains where, so much of it is about explicit control over exactly what it can do, but at the same time, like total permissionless and inability to control what happens next.
But maybe you don't have the control at all. Maybe it's like everything on the internet, it's like a long-standing performance. Maybe you don't have control about your blockchain where you put your work on. Maybe it will be history 10 years from now, maybe 50 years from now. How do you control it?
That's what I'm saying. It's totally impossible. I feel like it's an illusion inside of blockchain that you have more control, but in so many ways you have less control.
I think that's probably a feature of the kinds of spaces, ontologically speaking, right? Like a physical space you can curate. You can buy some land, right, and have a museum, build some walls up, and put pieces there, and prevent anyone from going in there because you have a monopoly of violence. The police is going to prevent them. Like, sort of exaggerating, but I'm saying that you can very easily create restrictions on physical space that are impossible to be created in digital space, no matter what kind of digital space it might be, because eventually the moment something goes up there, in some way or other, it does leave your control, and maybe that's kind of the point as well. I don't know if that's the point or not, like, so freeing the thing.
No, I think for the time being, I mean, since the internet was there, it was quite easy to get your own server and control the space, and not expensive as well to make a website, have your own server. And of course you have your internet provider and you have to switch, and yeah, it's never 100%. And that's why I started like, okay, what if you put it on your local machine, your work? Then you have total control, but only your local machine can see it if you don't put it on the network. So I don't think we have any choice for it, but yeah.
This question of like bit rot and persistence, has been around since way before. But even this sort of scenario of the artist who runs the server, the idea that maybe the artist takes the server down or doesn't pay the bill, it disappears, makes me think of Raphael Rosendahl, has these really explicit agreements to make sure that the collector's capable of running the server afterwards. But the inverse of that is just thinking that the artworks themselves, if they touch a nerve, if they have an audience, they will persist regardless of the sort of intention of the artist. I mean, I have a bunch of Jody pieces downloaded to my art folder that, should the servers go down, et cetera, I continue to have. Makes me think as well of, torrenting. There's Ryan Trey Carton as well, famously published all of his videos to YouTube. And I think there's, at least according to my film professor, like all of these 90s artists who were producing films that, were editioned or videos, and they were locked behind keys and people just never saw them again. And the careers of those artists, suffered from that because it was out of the mind, out of the public eye. And I think of torrenting sites that have artworks themselves continually to be shared, because if people want them, they will stay up. And the sort of far end of the spectrum of this, you could look at like Matt Fury's Pepe, in which it's so far out of the artist's control at this point that it's much, much larger than it ever could have been, probably as an intentional piece of work that has control and context. Although there is a really interesting dynamic there, as I think he's tried to take back control through different means.
So, what is the point then of these systems? Is it just persistence? Because control, we can take it out of the way, right? You have the openness of them, then you have a persistent element there. Is there anything else that because these are the ones that are always touted about both gaming and art and finance as well. Is there something you think that is missing from, I don't want to call it an affordance because that's also overused a lot, but something that emerges when you use these kinds of systems over other kinds of systems. Specifically by this kind of system, I mean like blockchains.
I feel like with blockchains, if it's not entirely true, it's at least a credible threat of persistence that's enough to sort of jumpstart the narrative. And all of these things sort of work on narratives and messaging. There's no guarantee that Ethereum even is going to be as persistent as people claim it will be. But it's a pretty credible threat. And so the idea that you can build on that narrative to make an artwork which relies on that as part of its narrative is really important. And it's a slightly more credible threat than I'm going to keep the server up all the time, or this artwork is going to be so important that every single person is going to keep a local copy of it.
Yeah, I think it's about the gatekeepers now. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee wanted to have the whole internet open and everyone connected. And then already in the 90s, some websites you could only enter with a login. And that resulted in places like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can only go to these places if you're a member. And if you're not a member, you're excluded. And I think and with blockchains it's the same. If you're not a member of the blockchain, you're excluded. And you might look only at the portal from the outside, but not further. You cannot participate. And I think you have to be really careful for that, not to make it like an elite thing to,
What's stopping you from participating in that case? Is it?
What stops you?
Yeah. Why do you think that people don't participate or find it difficult? What's the
maybe they don't want to be in that controlled system. Maybe
Also expensive to be in that controlled system.
Yeah.
Huge monetary barrier and technical barrier. But it's interesting to think about the public spaces in this context too. So you've got servers, which are basically common meeting places, public space, and yes, they can be controlled, access controlled, authenticated. And then you have, like on the other end of the spectrum, like a purely peer-to-peer internet, you could say, in which, I guess it's closer to like the Urbit vision. And I think there was a very early vision of this for the internet as well, Xanadu maybe, in which sort of, everyone carries around their own piece of the internet, and then you visit it through a peer-to-peer connection. And that's like the fully private version of the space. And I see blockchains as being fully public, but at a cost. The actual upkeep, the technical barrier, and the interactions, they have to be priced in these other ways in order to be sort of like public and persistent spaces that don't have the threat of being authenticated beyond your control or geo-blocked or something. But I think, Joan, you're right, they have their own gatekeeping, which is the cost at both of those levels, the technical cost and the actual interaction cost.
I mean, the reality is that sometimes the private public spaces are more accessible for bigger amounts of people than like the public ones. For example, I mean, a square in London that's privately owned will be much more accessible than, a piece of forest owned by the National Trust, which is still private, but potentially a little bit more public. And it's the same with the internet. Sometimes the privately owned website, Facebook, for example, will be way more accessible than, something that's truly open.
Do you think that public art, in the way that you were talking about earlier, which I think was sort of really interesting, which is we have this archaic notion of it, right? The sculpture in the garden or in the park. The interventions that you were describing, I think, I'm curious to hear if you think that there is what space exists for them in a gaming sort of infrastructure. Like, can you have gaming interventions that are public, that are digital? I'm adding words together here, but
yeah, I mean, definitely. I think we saw it. Is it on? No? Is that no?
Here's maybe.
Thanks. I mean, I think we definitely saw it during the pandemic, for example. I guess it's always. So I guess this is what I mean when I say that the public is a little bit of a tricky space. I don't think you can ever expect a public space to be accessed by everyone. It's just not possible, both physically, but also, let's say, on the internet. Because you need to direct people, you need to make sure that they can access it. So I think within games, it's kind of a little bit the same scenario. You can never expect it being fully accessed by everyone. But for example, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of pieces being recreated Now the name of the game escapes me, but it was the Animal Island that everyone... Yes, exactly. There's a lot of pieces being created there on like the open, accessible areas of the game. So I think, yes, public art can definitely happen there and is definitely happening, but yeah, it's never going to be accessed by everyone around the globe. I mean, that's just public art in general. Not everyone's going to see the sculptures in London or in Copenhagen or here in Brussels, but it will be seen.
This practice of using a semi-public game space for various art installations is also much older than even the game of Animal Crossing. I can't remember the name either, but I think it's either a 90s or 2000s game. It was sort of a shooting game in which you could mod different aspects of it. But yeah, I guess a certain degree of mod culture is necessary for various types of interactions there. But I think there was a lot of protest culture, basically using the bullets to paint very large protest signs, or I feel like this stuff came up in a lot of the context for some of your earlier work as well, Joan, as part of Jody.
Sure, we were totally parasites of all the games. And the more social modding was going on, it was a good way to make art out of it. And cheats and yeah.
Makes me wonder, actually, like mod culture.
But the thing was, in the 90s, these games were not online. They were networked, but really by cables. Like there were LAN games, and you had to be on your cable. Your office network could play these games in a network, but not through the internet. So there were like physical cables between computers. And then, for example, you could play those games in a network.
This conversation of modding, I think it's been around for a long time and mostly takes place in the context of games. Bringing up sort of the moddability of artworks in these persistent public spaces on blockchains, it makes me sort of wonder as well for a longer list of examples in a more traditional art context. I mean, I think of like this conceptual artists in the 60s who would recreate the most popular pop artists of the time.
Sure, also like some Fluxus artists and situationists, like for example Robert Filliou made like variations on games, and it's done by a lot of artists, not to take the game serious and not to take...
But I mean modding artworks rather than modding games, just the modding mentality, but applied to the artworks. I mean, in today's context, makes me think of, like,
think they
Terra,
don't call it modding, they say appropriation art, no?
What was that one?
Appropriation art, no?
Yeah, appropriation art, I think is maybe what we used to call it.
Yeah, we call it modding, but...
I have one last question that I would be curious to hear all your takes on, which is, I think when people think about art, traditionally speaking, they think about the gallery as like the space, right? That is a vessel that imbues meaning to the pieces that are displayed within it, gains meaning from these pieces, and it's sort of like, you know, it's just a very liminal place that you enter, and then you're in art, and you're surrounded by art, and then you leave it, and you're sort of back in the real world, where there might be instances of art, but nonetheless, like this is the sort of, at least I grew up with this perception when I was young, right? And this space does two things. It contextualizes and it sort of frames the works, but it also sort of, you know, contains them, literally contains them, right? Because like they're all there. Do you think is there something equivalent for digital art, and do we need anything that's digitally equivalent, or is it okay that we have a variety of front ends and indexers that are sort of all, you know, curators speaking to different things in various places? Is there a need for a hub that's kind of like both a container, framer, and a sort of, you know, spatial? I'm not talking about like a metaverse gallery, right? Like not necessarily, at least.
The White Cube Online.
Yeah.
I guess as a curator, this is a little bit of like the conundrum, but also like the beauty of working with digital art is that it's quite free and floating, but like internet art as well is of course quite hard to contain, and I guess it comes back to this kind of curating context. I think it's very tempting as a curator to try to be in control the whole time. And I think this is one of the questions that I always try to keep in mind when I do exhibitions or projects, is that like when should the curation stop? But to go back to your question, I don't know. I don't know if we need a specific space, because I also think some pieces that exist online is just meant to be shown in that context, and they don't necessarily need to be contained within a space, because that's kind of doesn't destroy them, but potentially change them a little bit. And I guess this comes back to what Richard Serra would say as well, like the famous case of the tilted arc that got moved in New York. And basically what he was saying, he was writing a letter about it, saying that if this piece is being moved, the piece is being destroyed. This piece does not exist any longer. I don't know if it's that extreme, but it does potentially change the context and but potentially change the work a little bit.
Yeah, but the digital artworks are changing constantly. I mean, they change format if they are displayed on a different screen. They change during the time of a different computer. So they're not stable artworks like Richard Serra, who is like stuck. So I think you have to see it in a media specific way, like more like a McLuhan statement, like the medium is the message. And okay, there's work made for television, there's work made for radio, and these were all artworks. And it's strange that there's always like, okay, how do we connect that to a gallery? Like an artwork as a radio show, you don't display in a gallery. And it could be possible that an artwork as a digital work you don't display in a gallery. But still, sometimes it's displayed on big LED walls in the city. It can take all shapes. But it's not really necessary to frame everything to the traditional art world.
I think this idea of digital artworks being mostly performance is true, and I think this concept has always overwhelmed me a bit, that there's no sort of beginning or end. It's hard to find the difference between yourself and the artwork. You can get sort of lost in that, and that plus probably a certain degree of OCD has made me always gravitate to this thinginess of the file. And I think it's probably why NFTs really resonated, where the artwork can be conceptual, it can be non-ending, it can be performance, but there's still a very thingy thing attached to it that you're able to sort of hang your coat on and use as the point that you pivot around, or that reminds you that the work exists. I think that I find myself doing this even with like 60s performance art. You think of the one photo that represents that performance, or you have the book or the textbook that sort of like really solidifies, or the Wikipedia article even. There's something that you need to become like the thingy thing that sort of verifies that the performance exists. And I think that's really hard to translate to a physical space. I think obviously physical objects in a physical space work really well. There's something really holy and romantic and almost religious about the sacred space, the aura of all of that. And I think that's important, but I don't think that it necessarily translates to a digital experience very well. And I think that if anything, I'm able to kind of procure that same holy aura or whatever from this concept that there's a file or there's an ID, that the very sort of core of what is itself like an extremely sprawling and unending file format or art format.
Well, I think, and when I said gallery, by the way, I did not mean physical gallery necessarily. I meant any kind of repository, however you want to think of it. But it sounds like the kind of thing you're describing, which is the object and the artwork, is just the thing we agree to point to as the thing. Like that's it, right?
And I actually think that the question about the indexers, et cetera, all of those are just more fingers pointing to the thing. And the more fingers pointing to the thing, the better, I think, or the more real it becomes.
It's quite interesting to have this. I mean, sadly, I've never had a conversation with performance artists from the 60s, but I really do wonder if they would agree on the fact that what's being shown is the art piece or just archiving of the piece. I suspect a majority of them would say that actually no, what you're showing on the wall is definitely not the piece because it's not the performance, but it's actually the archiving of the piece that's being shown. And I guess it kind of comes down to a little bit around digital art as well, like what is the most important part to preserve if you can only preserve one thing? Would it be the code, or would it be the visual, or would it be what would you actually preserve from it?
The story, the history.
Yeah, actually, this story, this history, it reminds me recently there was, Core Archangel did a playthrough of Michel Majerus's archive of his computer at Michel Majerus in Berlin. And so they, part of this was this idea about restoring his laptop from 2008, where you could kind of see this painter's studio, the works in progress, layouts for different exhibitions and stuff. And this wasn't even itself an artwork, but this idea of like sort of an overwhelming amount of digital detritus that like you could use as a stand-in for many sort of unending artist practice in the digital realm is like indecipherable without a story. And this idea that Corey went in there, became very familiar with the environment, and then did these like YouTubes where he talked you through what's going on in there. It was really a aha moment for me about like, what do we do with this growing and growing pile of data, of digital files, et cetera? It's like, it becomes indecipherable. And it's amazing when you have access to that archive and you go through it yourself, but you're still unlikely to ever really, penetrate what's going on there. And the idea that you need a guide was just so illuminating. I was like, oh my God, of course, you need a guide to take you through and make the story of the artwork for you. And I don't think it should be exclusively that one guide's interpretation of that, but the idea that you can revisit it through other people's lenses, through other guides, through other stories, and there's like a possibility of layering of that was really an exciting concept for me.
Amazing. I think we're out of time, but if you guys have any closing thoughts or final remarks or anything. Okay. Is there any closing remarks from the audience? No?
I think we said it all.
We said it all. This is it. Let's cover the thing. We solved the problem. We can all go home now. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks so much, everyone. There's drinks downstairs for the next couple of hours and more talks there. Thank you so much.